Hi, welcome to the Social Media Church podcast. My name is Nick Runyon, and I am here with a friend and all-around genius that I'm happy to introduce you all to today, Matt Engle. Matt is a research fellow with Leadership Network and the man behind a lot of what's happening at a tech company called Gloo to help churches use social media signals and big data to do a better job and more effectively reach their communities, which we're going to get into today. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, man. Thank you.
We've been connected through some mutual friends. I had the privilege of visiting with you in Boulder, Colorado, where your office is a couple of weeks ago. And we just had an awesome conversation that I've been sharing with a few people ever since then. And so I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today so that we can talk about some of these things that you're working on, because I think that you are really focused on helping the church reach their communities more effectively. And I'm excited to get into that today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we go there, why don't you just share with our listeners a little bit about your background, kind of where you're coming from so that we can better understand how you got into big data and using that for the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's super good to see you again. Background, was interested in sort of swimming upstream a little bit of some of the stuff that we were studying. So bachelor's is in criminology and criminal justice with the focus around, how do we move upstream instead of dealing with the reactive natures of things that happened. Got connected into higher education, started pursuing some of that with regards to similar things, like how do we go upstream of some of the attributes that we're actually seeing within higher education. Master's degrees in organizational design and development, and was interested in how organizations function and work and how do we get better and improve the things that we are currently operating within. So all that sort of smashed together, and then my time at a four-year institution where we were really looking at what we were calling sort of engagement management. How do we do something slightly different with regards to finding the right student for the institution? And then how do we help support them on their journey to success, not just graduation, but what does a successful alumni look like and beyond? So engagement is sort of this holistic view of the individual person and mapping that journey. So when we started doing that, things started really rolling. We started getting into, we were sitting on a lot of information on our students that if we knew a little bit more about them, we could actually match them with the right next step, and it would improve both their entry into the institution, but also the subsequent retention and ultimately the graduation. All that was happening while I was just a lay leader at a church, small church. We were right around 600,000 people. Then we started doing some fun stuff where, I was on the clean team all the way up to some leadership roles there at the church. And so we started having the question at the church level of like, hey, can we take some of the same methodologies that we were deploying within some of these other entities, higher education, criminal justice, all of these different views, and actually apply it into the church? And so we did. It jumped on staff there, felt like the Lord was leading us in that direction to take a step away from what we were currently doing and see if we couldn't help advance the kingdom. And we started doing that and basically started mapping out what does engagement look like in the church through the lens of knowing our people and knowing our city.
Yeah, let me interrupt you there, because I think you've mentioned a few interesting things. So like upstream, this concept. So if I understand it correctly, like in the university setting, you are looking at, by upstream, you mean you can identify maybe in like middle school, a student that has a propensity to not only do well in that university, and so you can kind of target them or create programs that bring them in, but then also students that will graduate successfully and be good alumni. So you have that type of view of the landscape.
Right, because you figure we have the full attributes because we know what a person did when they graduated from the institution, and we know those that didn't. Right, so all we're doing is now sort of re-engineering what they did at the institution, and then what brought them to the institution, and what
Right.
are the commonalities amongst those that were successful and those that weren't.
Yeah.
And how do we then sort of streamline some of those successes so that we can actually match somebody on a better journey? Like it's sort of if you're not good in calculus, the likelihood of you being a good engineer is probably not very high. But
Right.
so how do we acknowledge that out the gate, and either throw a bunch of resource against it to help build up some of those deficiencies and competencies that need to be improved, but also at the same point in time have a good conversation that says, actually, but you're doing really well over here in these three things, and based upon that, you might want to consider an English degree or some of those things. So yeah, it was very much like, what did they look like before they stepped foot at the university? How do we have a conversation that says, hey, this isn't the right time? Because that was our model. Like, instead of just go get more for growth's sake, or just let's keep everybody, it was really about, no, how do we help you, Nick, get the right information at the right time relative to the right program at the institution? And some of that was, oh, well, you want to start at a 2-year community college and then jump over. Great, we can map that out for you. Because it was all about improving the efficacy of your own individual journey, more so than growth for growth's sake or retain for retain's sake.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so when you move into this leadership position at the church, and I believe you're a pastor as well, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So had an opportunity to teach and serve in a leadership role with your church. Tell us how you took those concepts and then began to apply those in a local church context.
Yeah. So super crazy, right? Like, God was just, hit the 2x4 across the head, which is usually what I need.
Yeah.
And so that was emerging. And it was one of those things that, like, hindsight, looking back, God was just sovereign and good. I sort of stepped foot going, okay, what am I doing? And I just started asking a bunch of questions, right? Just, hey, I've never been on staff at a church, had only seen it from the outside perspective. So I just started asking a bunch of questions. And when my inquisitive nature was just like, hey, I just don't know what I don't know. I need to increase that bucket of unknowns so that I can, not mess up like I normally do at the same scale, right? So when I started doing that, we started sort of unearthing myths that were actually not true at our church, but had become a fabric of what we were talking about at the church level. So the example that I like to give is, like, within week 1, I had met with a couple of different team members at the church and said, hey, tell me about the people in our church. Like, help me just get a basic understanding. And I won't forget it. One of the guys that said, well, Matt, 4 out of 5 couples in our church are headed for divorce.
Wow.
And I was like, wow, okay, that seemed, again, from an outside perspective, I was like, well, that seems high. Well, the next weekend, we literally
80% is high.
right. We literally vocalized that from the stage, though. That was the crazy part. I had a subjective view. This person had passed on that one single data point, and data in the church world's typically used as an illustration to cause, anxiety and move into something, right? But rarely is actually helping drive the efficacy of the ministry, and helping sort of, what I would say is, it's data is to inform. It's not to be data driven. You're to be data informed, because that allows the Holy Spirit to speak to us in different capacities and go against what the data might suggest. But we should be informed about it. So our pastor gets up on stage and he preaches this thing, and then he uses that stat. And so literally we're sitting with our small group, and I look down the aisle and I'm like, well, which one of you 5, don't suck? Because apparently we all got divorce papers in our car.
Wow.
So that one single point caused me to really be like, okay, now I'm going to go out and actually find out what's going on. And I have to give my team member a lot of credit. Through his lens, that was reality. He was a counselor day in and day out, 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. He was counseling people. So yeah, rarely is the person showing up saying, hey, we're just doing well. I just thought I'd come and chat with you. Like, that just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So the objective view was for us to actually go out and survey people and have some conversations and begin to get smarter about what does it mean for us to steward the people within the context of our church. We started doing that, and we found out a bunch of really cool things. One of the first things that I did when we joined staff was I was trying to figure out, like, well, we just don't have data. And then yet I'm working, we have churches right now that we're working with where they're telling me we're drowning in data. It's this happy medium that we were trying to get at. And so I'm like, well, from my past, we usually have a lot of data that we're just sitting on that we're not using sort of to our advantage to help us know our people in the context of ministry. And so we actually every Tuesday at 9:00 we had staff prayer, and every Tuesday we would pray for all the prayer requests that were submitted. And so I asked the question, I'm like, can anybody actually tell me what we're praying for? And we could name them off, marriage, divorce, all of that stuff. Like
Right.
we could name them, but we couldn't quantify it. And
Right.
so, for the span of about 3.5, 4 months, I basically and I'm not a statistician, right? I'm not a researcher. I'm blessed in this nexus of being able to understand data and research and theology and stitch it together a little bit. And so we just applied a standard naming convention to every prayer request that was submitted online, in person, over the phone, or through email. And then I just pumped it into a free word cloud on Google, and,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it actually showed the pulse of what our people were asking for prayer for. And
Wow.
that was the compelling piece for us, because it really was catalytic in our stewardship of, hey, this is what people are asking for the church for prayer. That's an intimate part of their heart.
Right.
If we know that, can we do something about that preventatively? So we started mapping over the entire year. We just started aggregating all of that data so that we could begin to understand, wow, there's some common trends that are emerging.
Yeah.
For example, finances was being asked, was popping as the number one prayer request through the month of January through March. Well, that's one data point, right? And then when we started doing some research, divorce filings in the state in Arizona where we were living and where our church was, the state filings for divorce in February were some of the highest throughout the calendar year. So we started looking at, okay, well, what happens in the church around, December, that people are now asking for prayer about finances? Well, it was
Yeah.
Christmas.
Start looking for those leading indicators.
Right. Well, and so you figure, we spent the whole month of December preaching on spend less and give more, generosity, stewardship, bless others, all that stuff. And basically we didn't change any behaviors. It was like they're still spending themselves into oblivion. And now they're asking for prayer like woulda, coulda, shoulda. So what we did is we actually were able to preach on stewardship and generosity a full month before, in November. We actually were able to show the people in the church, like, this is why we're covering this now. Because for the last couple of years, we've been praying for this disproportionately during this time. We don't want it to be hooked to Christmas, because there's still the chaos of all of that stuff that's emerging.
Right.
So let's talk about what does healthy stewardship and generosity look like. We're going to run some weekday programming to help. So whatever that financial stewardship programming that the churches were running is great. And what we saw is we were actually able to increase engagement within the programming structure of the church, and decrease, yet having this similar context as far as volume of prayer requests, but be able to decrease the number of those that were praying for finances that following year. So
Wow.
our thing was like, it was all about engagement, but using data to help inform what we might want to do to increase the engagement and the efficacy of the person. Again, it was all about getting back down to that individual level and helping them on their journey.
That's awesome. And so, I mean, you just mentioned so much there. Looking at leading indicators, I love that you can see a real impact, like in a measurable way, and you start to see that life change come about from the use of data. I think something that you mentioned, maybe a lot of our listeners would kind of suffer from, if suffer is the right word, but it's like, I've got all this data, I've got too much data. But I think often we tend to think about that as, website impressions, click-through rates, things that we don't really kind of know how do you qualify that stuff in a real world ministry environment.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about is there's data all around if we just kind of change our perspective on it. I mean, you're talking about the topics of prayer requests as actionable data within
Correct.
a church environment. And I think churches of all sizes could probably apply that type of understanding to kind of their data workflow is maybe how you and I would talk about it.
Yeah.
Even though that workflow might not exist, in most cases. But in addition to prayer requests, I mean, what other kinds of, just off the top of your head,
Yeah.
maybe, like what are data sources that just exist in your everyday normal ministry environment that people might not think about them as data?
Yeah, well, I mean, and again, right? I talked to 5 people and they tell me I did a good job on this thing that I delivered from the platform. And so somehow I extrapolate that to everybody when
Right.
really,
Yeah.
300 people left the church because I said suck on the stage or whatever, right? Like,
Or
you know,
the one guy that really has a problem with it, and you're like, oh, that
exactly.
bombed. It was terrible,
Exactly. So there is an element of again of sort of taking the objective view
Mm.
in aggregate, right, and trying to get to a place where we can begin to extrapolate some of the norms that are emerging and look for patterns. So we actually started deploying 3 basic questions hooking to anything that somebody within our church would take part in. We just started to develop a culture that, hey, we want your feedback, good, bad, or indifferent, because we're not the smartest people in the room. Like, outside of Jesus returning, like, we all suck at something. So like, acknowledge that reality and be a student first. So we were soliciting sort of that feedback loop constantly because it would help us improve the ministry.
Oh,
So
wow.
we would ask things like, the first question was like, hey, on a scale of 1 to 7, what did you think about it? Like, on a scale, just a scale 1 to 7. The next question was one that I liked, which was, would you bring a friend? On a scale of 1 to 7, how likely would you bring a friend? And then the third one was just an open-ended text field. It was just like, hey, tell us anything that you want. What we would then do, and it was somewhat laborious, but we had sort of this burning desire to really steward our ministries well. So we just started pouring into that, and we would just begin to look at patterns. Wow, those that are 18 to 35 scored that they really, really liked it. They would absolutely bring a friend. And here's some of the text field word cloud pop-up things that emerged on why. Man, those that were 65 and older, they're middle of the road. They probably wouldn't bring a friend. And here were some of the things that emerged out of that. Well, then we have now a structural decision to make with regards to, well, what are we trying to accomplish? So those, I mean, within 3 questions at aggregate, and by the time we were all said and done, I mean, our church was right around 9,000, so we had grown dramatically, largely just around knowing our people and knowing our city and filling in the gaps, right? So that's a basic one. The other one that I think that churches that we're starting to see churches use more is sort of the Net Promoter Score.
Yeah.
And
Which I love. I'm a big NPS fan.
Agreed. So how do we take that and just apply it into the ministry and we have a couple of different use cases where a church actually deployed this and based upon those that submitted it and the data that the church actually had. So they were looking at, here's all the people that give, who serve, and who are in a small group, right? By definition, that's that's somebody that we would say is really committed to the church. When they deployed the Net Promoter Score to the whole church, they started slicing the data. What they found is that the lowest scoring individuals on the NPS were those that gave and served and were in a group.
Really?
And
That's surprising.
When they dug into it, here was some of the feedback that they got from the attendees was, we're comfortable. We don't really want to give up our seat. Like, we're comfortable. That was the feedback. Yet their highest scores were people that had only been there or had checked their kids in, or however, they were tracking, like, they've had one form of engagement with the church for 6 weeks. So basically they're new to church. Within 6 weeks, they were scoring the highest, like they want to bring a friend.
Right.
So that right there was one unique data point. Like, okay,
interesting.
How representative is this across other churches, and are there any other patterns that would emerge out of that? Right. So that was something that was really powerful. That was super easy to deploy.
Probably should have said this at the beginning. That information is fascinating, but it occurs to me there's some people that might not understand Net Promoter Score.
Yeah.
So if you're listening to this and you don't know what Net Promoter Score is, or NPS, do a quick Google search. Out in Silicon Valley, like what I've experienced out there is that this is like the number in a lot of cases, especially if you're building an app or you've got some type of software product that the question is, would you recommend this to a friend? I mean, that's like the single question measured on a scale of 1 to 10 or
Yep.
0 to 10. And only 9 and 10 count as promoters.
Yep.
There's some neutral, but then the rest are detractors. And the net promoter score is the difference between the promoters and the detractors.
Yeah.
So, if you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you to Google it, look up how to do that. And things like MailChimp are now making it really easy to deliver these kinds of net promoter score surveys to your congregation or to your audience. I think that's fascinating. It's the comfortability, what we traditionally would say is like the good church attendee, the good church member are not actually your biggest promoters. That's an interesting insight.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, and we've started to see other patterns, right, emerge. And again, in a humble posture, acknowledging that we're not all sliced bread.
Right.
It really paints a really cool picture for us to be free to ask for feedback and then activate upon it. The one thing that we were doing to try to develop this healthy culture of feedback loops was when we would ask a question, we provided the results back quickly. Because the gap in time is like, well, they're just asking for more questions. They're not going to do anything with it. It was like, no. Here we asked, and here's the aggregated results of this. And what that did is, one, if somebody who didn't participate in the answering the questions saw the results and said, oh, I don't agree with that, they now want to opt in to submitting their feedback going forward. So we had this sort of byproduct that was emerging of like, here's a whole bunch of people that do, and I didn't, so I want to get in there next time and actually submit it. So we actually started seeing an increased participation rate of feedback loops, and it helped us steward our leaders. We started to identify gaps in leadership development based upon people who were teaching classes and others that were teaching similar classes, and we started to see patterns emerge of like, wow, this cohort of leaders is kind of struggling based upon the scores that we were getting back from the people. Let's not just cut them. Let's develop them and really pour into them from a ministry perspective. And these guys are doing well. What are they doing well? And can we equip them to teach others? Like, it really became this generative network effect that we hadn't planned on, largely just because we started inquisitively asking questions and then delivering the results and developing that feedback.
I think whether you're data minded and, kind of really interested in the numbers, or you're really interested in kind of, this is unfair because it's always both.
Yeah.
But you might just be like the ministry minded person where it's like, I don't care about the numbers. I just want to love on people.
Right.
I think what you're painting is a picture where these two things are supporting one another very well, and one is leading to the other. And that's probably so far away from most realities. I mean, even in a business context, much less a ministry context, leaders are sometimes afraid to ask those questions because we don't want to know what the answers are.
Right.
So if somebody's in an environment where, I kind of just feel, or I know anecdotally that there's some issues going on here, I'm never going to get people to sign off on a survey of our congregation asking that question.
Right.
What would you say to that? Like, how do you even begin?
I look at it as, Jesus was a priest, king, and a prophet, right? And this really does probably come from the king camp. Like, you've got your priests and your prophets. This probably does fit in the window of the king lane. But I do believe that to be better priests and prophets, we should be bringing forward information that helps us be informed. And I just think that that's good stewardship. And we do it all the time. And we can go back to scripture to see where they were using data and they were informed about what they were doing. I mean, even this world, and I know we're going to get there as far as talking about some of the big data, but even back in the day, they were using big data. They were just using it in an analog fashion. We just have advanced on the technology side relative to what they were doing back then.
Right.
So I don't think it's to be something feared, because I look at that as something then really I would question the motive of why I wouldn't want to know. Because now there is an element of like, that's something internal to me that I need to work on with Christ, because I shouldn't be in that mode of like, nope, sort of hearsay, I don't want to know, don't tell me, and we're fine. Like, ignorance is not bliss in that regard. Like,
Well, ignorance can be deadly as well. I mean, if you
Right.
can't solve a problem that hasn't been identified. And so
Right.
like problem identification is just so key in finding a solution. So you're right. Let's understand what the problems are if they exist, so that we can address those.
Yeah, to that point, it's like, right, hey, this for especially I'll say for successful churches, right? Those guys have the hardest time adapting to new models.
Yeah.
But as a good pastor and friend of mine would say, success breeds complacency and complacency breeds failure. So
Mm,
if you're not constantly on that innovative side, I mean, you can look at the research right now and say, hey, some of the largest people groups are leaving the church at a greater rate than at any point in time in history outside of when Jesus commissioned the church in Acts. And so my question is if we've clung to a model instead of the mission, we're lost. And the way models improve is through sort of what I would say is data intelligence, even though that's just a fancy word for gathering information and acting upon it.
yeah. Even in the framing of my statement, I said problems. There's also opportunities that are sometimes identified. And I
Right.
think that's where I want to turn a corner here, because I think, and I think we talked about this when we were together a couple of weeks ago, but there's a lot of people that talk about, like what you just said, people leaving the church, um, and you're right on when you said earlier in the program that often data is used to kind of cast doubt or set up, the solution that we have to come through. I really want to know what your view is of like the opportunities, and the really some of the advancements that churches are making. Before we get into that, tell us a little bit about what Gloo is. What's this organization, this company that you're working with now? It looked impressive. Walking through the office, you've got developers all over the place. I mean, this is like a tech company nestled in the middle of Boulder, Colorado, and you guys are doing some incredible things. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So super fortunate to be able to take what we kind of incubated at a local church, right? Just a local level. Felt like the Lord was leading us to do some things on a couple of different projects that we were able to take and scale a little bit,
Mm,
and then just more recently take those findings that we were able to do in the project and really bring them forward into a technical infrastructure that could actually help facilitate the speed that's needed to serve churches. And so yeah, we've developed and have built the largest data platform that I know of in the world that's missionally aligned,
mm,
that's actually designed to serve the local church at scale. So it's not like, oh, well, we have, 40,000 people and we have 12 campuses, so we can afford to write, this big of a check. No. It's actually built to scale, whether you're a 50-person, downtown city church to a multi-site church that has, 40 to 50,000 people. Great. I mean, again, we're fortunate, right, to be able to look at the kingdom and be kingdom minded relative to local church geo minded. And so that's an element that we've basically unearthed through the times at Leadership Network and some of the stuff that we've been researching there, and now bringing these capacities to bear through Gloo. And so what we've found is that, and there's probably some listeners that would maybe disagree with this, but what we found on our findings is two things. One, transformational money is not the problem. It's just not. Like, God called you to steward what you got with what you got, and moving, but moving the efficacy of that spend of, and I equate it this way, right? You could give $100 million to a church and it would break them.
mm.
And more so, they would spend it like they spend 10. And so now I'll say from our church, we probably were, I would say we're generous if we say, hey, we were doing $7 out of that 10 really well. 3 was a waste of money. How do we take that same 10 and move us to 8 and 9? That means transformational money is really not the problem. The other piece of this that we found is that content wasn't the problem. I mean,
Hmm.
by and large,
That's
there's
interesting.
content. You go to Barnes and Noble and go down the marriage and family section and tell me content's a problem. Like, there's a gazillion books out there about content. So what we found was one of the limiting constraints for churches was additional capacities, infrastructures that allow them to speed up the efficacy of their ministry. when we bring to bear some of these capacity building entities, now you're talking about being able to do some of the advancements. And then as ministry improves, engagement goes up, attendance is going to go up, baptisms go up, the things that we typically measure within the four walls, butts, budgets, and baptisms, like that's great, but that's a function of increased velocity of engagement typically.
Mm-hmm.
And the other piece to that we would say within the data and what we're starting to see as far as now that these capacities are to bear is now the church can actually get optics into what we would say on the stage, right? We'd say this on the platform is like, the church isn't the four walls, the church is the people, yet everything we measure is four walls driven.
Right.
What if we could bring capacities to bear to actually see the implications outside of the four walls? And how do we engage people in the community that want to be engaged with around things that they care about, not just the parameters of the four walls?
Yeah.
So those are some of those fun emerging patterns and trends that have kind of come out of the tech side, where these capacities are laying foundational layers to actually sit ministries upon to get smarter faster.
The word engagement is often confused for a number of different things, none of which are necessarily wrong. But in this context, just give us a quick definition of when you're talking about community engagement or engaging your congregation. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah. So I look at it as this way. Engagement is anything that I'm doing, period, is an engagement thing.
Okay.
Whether I'm giving, whether I'm serving, whether I'm inviting people, whether I'm in a group, that's a function of engagement. But so is spiritual formation. How am I reading the Bible? Do I pray? Do I pray with my kids? Then I have this other form of engagement that says, I drive to work. That's one data point. That's engaging in. So engagement to me is the holistic approach of the individual. And then it's really measuring what I call the transactions within the church relative to the engagement of the person. And what does that look like? What is gap engagement? Because again, so I came on Sunday, I came again on Sunday, but what did I do in the gap? That's actually a testament of what my spiritual formation probably looks like, right? Time is the most precious commodity we have on the planet. In Matthew 6, Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. So if time is my treasure, what am I doing with my time? I.e., what am I engaging in that would be relative to what's happening, where I'm headed?
So you've moved from, looking at big data at a university setting into a local church, using data to drive decisions, ministry decisions, see life change and impact.
Yep.
Now you're looking at this on a massive scale with one of the largest ministry-focused data sets in the world, as far as we know.
Yep.
And I think you're right on that, by the way. Tell us maybe just a couple of things about this, and like what have you seen change? How do you put that to use to see measurable life change? And then I think you and I should get into talking about how this works. Should we do it? How do we steward that well?
Yep.
It's some interesting things. If you're talking about time, like how do you know how I spend my time to and from work during my commute? But I think you have a way to see into that.
Right.
Yeah.
Great question. So in the next 60 seconds, there's going to be 156 million emails sent around the world. There's 4.1 million videos on YouTube viewed, 900,000 logins into Facebook, 3.5 million Google searches, all within the next 60 seconds.
And you can see how much of that.
There are patterns that you can see, right? So
right.
That's the fun stuff. One of the easiest things that we started doing was looking at go to Google Trends and type in divorce and see how many times in your local geo divorce is being searched for. Right there is one data point that would give insights to a ministry that says, wow, we have full-time pastors on staff that do counseling for people struggling in their relationship. And here are all these people searching the word divorce or marriage help or whatever, right? Yeah. Like if we knew that, would it cause us to do something? So case in point, one of the things that most churches, I mean, and you're a social media, podcast. So most churches probably have some form of social media platform that they're using to communicate to, external people or internal people, however they're deploying it. Right. So in those instances, within 30 likes on Facebook knows more about you than your friends.
Oh, wow.
In 50 likes, Facebook knows more about you than your family. And then it just goes on from there. So we can begin to see how churches even having Facebook pages is catalytic to other entities, selling more things and doing more stuff for what I would say non-missional purposes. Is there a way and is there a fashion that we could take similar approaches to ministry and actually apply that to the church setting and say, wow, instead of, and I grew up in a premillennialist fundamental King James Version only Baptist church, right? That was my background. And so I was told regularly, you've got to believe what we believe, and then you can belong. Mm-hmm. When in all actuality, people today actually want to belong before they believe what you believe. And so how do we create these instances where people can actually get connected and bump into Jesus, and eventually they're going to meet, know, and follow him? The ability for us to be able to take information and apply it at a macro scale. We were doing this in an analog setting back in the book of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah chapter 1:1-4, read the book and then and check it out. His brother and his friends approach, and and Nehemiah asked his brother and his friends 2 questions. Tell me about the people and tell me about the city. Mm-hmm. They used big data then to actually look and provide Nehemiah the 2 answers. Hey, the people are beaten, battered, and bruised, and the gates are all burned down, and everything's going to hell in a handbasket. In essence, that's the Matt Engle version of the Bible. In essence, they used big data. They didn't interview every single person that lived in the city, but what they did do, and if I put my mind's eye on it, they probably did walk around and see a lot of people hurt, a lot of people really messed up, and in aggregate, they rolled that data up in using, again, the mind power. They said, hey, this is the synopsis of the people and the city. How do we take that and then at scale do that for churches? Ministry leaders do this all the time right now. If a ministry leader were to walk out on their parking lot on a weekend and see that, a whole bunch of people, let's say more than 80% of the people that they saw were all weeping and crying. That's big data, right? Something happened, and the majority of our people are expressing, tears and remorse or whatever. The question then becomes is how do we steward this well in the context of getting upstream again? So it's like, I'm constantly, I was meeting with a bunch of people that, in our church that had broken marriages. Marriages were falling apart. Well, if I would have known 6 months ago that they just went out and dropped $50,000 on a car they couldn't afford, and then they started doing all of these other things, now it's led to a place where their marriage is on the rocks and they're headed toward divorce. It's like woulda, coulda, shoulda. I wish we would have had a conversation up here about how these things could be causations to where you're going to end up with regards to your marriage. Same thing with regards to church then. So we just need to do that at scale. So we've got, a couple of different predictive models, just like anyone else. When you click I accept on a $4,000 TV to have a personalized experience, if you don't click it, you just wasted $4,000 and you're only getting like 30% of the capacity of the TV. So you click that, there's a reason why. And the reason why is because you want to be served the right information at the right time relative to me, not relative to anyone else. So some of the models that we have are like, hey, what would it look like for us to know, that somebody is actually moving toward divorce versus somebody else? And based upon data, is there a way that we can actually surface this in an intelligent, good governance way that says, hey, 25% of your church body is in the top decile for headed toward divorce? If a church leader knew that, what would they do? And especially if they look at the community and it's higher in the church than it is in the community, well, now we have a real opportunity, to your point. That to me is a great scenario. That's saying that the church is a safe place for messy people.
Yeah.
The question is, in some context, if you are just like, hey, as a church, if your model is be in a group, give, serve, and invite people, but there's no foundational layer for healthy relationships in the church because you're preaching through the book of Acts, and the only time you cover marriage in that book is Ananias and Sapphira, and they both died, so it's not your pro-marriage sort of relational thing.
Right.
It's like, does that cause us to want to actually take not a hard right, but a 1 or 2 degrees improvement on the efficacy of our ministry, and then chase it out 5 years and see what happens?
Well, part of every church model is also what you've mentioned a couple of times is what you say from the platform. And I think what I've heard you say is that some of this data and the trends that you're identifying are proactively shining a light on things that should be considered by the church. And so I want to make the point here that this doesn't kind of alienate or eliminate really, as far as I can tell, anything within the church model. It helps to inform the pastor and the leadership about how to apply some of the model in a more effective way.
Right.
I've talked on here a couple of times with Nils about in our work with CV Outreach, the marriage and divorce thing is an interesting touch point, which you and I've talked about a little bit. Mm-hmm. We see when somebody uses language, including keywords that talk about divorce, as opposed to like marriage crisis. When I use the word divorce, people are 10 times more likely to engage, to seek help, because they've crossed a line. You know, mm-hmm. It's gone from marriage trouble to, oh, this thing has fallen apart, and you know, we need some help. That's kind of where we're seeing people, their activity through a Google search. What you're talking about are some of these social signals that you're picking up on both inside and outside of the church, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
In your language is like 5 minutes down the road, this is where you're going.
Right.
Do you have any, case studies or examples of how that has been applied and really seen that interrupted?
Yeah. So for example, right, we grew up in a church where it was like, invite a friend, invite a friend, invite a friend. And yet, I mean, now it's like, no, invite the right friend first. Like, let's acknowledge that not every person is actually hardwired to show up on Sunday.
Okay.
Some people, to get them on Sunday, need to show up on Tuesday. And where in our world did we actually think that, like, you know, that was the best idea? Like, people want to be treated like, as you know me as Matt, Nick, you're matching me in your head with something, right? The better we know, the better we can match. And so that, I think, freedom to allow our people to actually do that match well is super important. And so, like, for example, some of the research that we've been able to do is like, you know, there are models that exist on people who are currently attending church and people that aren't. Yet there's also models that people that have an emotional desire to attend church. Well, to steward the ministry then, especially for those are the teams that are your executive pastors or communications people that are listening, it's like, would we not want to steward the limited dollars that we have to invite the person who's not currently attending a church, but emotionally wants to attend, instead of doing this blanket, everybody should attend? It's like getting up on stage telling everybody, you all should, everybody needs to serve in children's ministry. It's like, that's asking for chaos and a problem at the church level if I get into that classroom because I use duct tape when there's problems with children. Like, that's the easiest. No, I kid. But in all reality, right, if we knew that we had people in our church that were actually gifted and God's called them to do something slightly different, could we not do this? Everybody must do to, no, this is your best next step. And for the person that doesn't attend church, it's like, hey, emotionally, you want to attend church? Like, let's bring that person into the equation on Sunday. And then, hey, you're just looking for a fun time and you don't know about Jesus, but you want to have a great time with your spouse, come to this date night. Like, those are just different dynamics with regards to ministry that we're now on the forefront of.
But then advertising that date night opportunity to the right people,
right?
Both inside and outside.
Exactly.
And so there's, you know, and I've talked in the past about a knowing and doing gap, you know, and others have as well. But like, I think this is an interesting concept. So it's like, okay, I hear you, I'm tracking with you guys, this is all really interesting. How do I I know what I need to do. How do I get there?
Yeah.
What are some things that people can do without giant data sets and
Yep.
tools that apply some of these principles in their own reality?
So out the gate, one that we're starting to see is just you have untapped potential in your church right now of people that eat, breathe, and sleep this type of thinking.
Hmm.
What better volunteer opportunity? Again, the church is all about engagement. That's the function that we should be measuring against. So if we can increase somebody's engagement in the church by calling on them and saying, hey guys, we're standing up sort of just a data team. We don't know anything yet, but like, does anybody do this for a living? I've seen across the country now churches where they're full-blown data scientists attending a church and they're being told serve in children's ministry when really this is their calling.
Right.
Like, so I would say that's one easy step right now to begin to formulate what would it look like as our church to steward the people, because at the end of the day, the data is a person and we're called to minister and love on them.
That's right.
Our ability to know them better is the gap. That's what we need to be able to increase our deficiency on. So it's literally like, how do we close the gap on the know and match side? We start developing that team, get that volunteer group. I'll make sure that you have a list of some free resources that are completely available that any person should be like, at least again, acknowledging like, hey, here's the profile of our city in a visual way that I can interpret it. It's not a spreadsheet with a whole bunch of percentages. It's actually visually represented in a way that I can digest it and then inform where we would do our ministry outreach opportunities.
Yeah.
So assemble that team. The other piece that I have seen that I think is really important is cleaning of your own internal data. To be honest with you, we in church world don't really think systems and structures and processes, but in this instance, for us to steward that, and again, I believe we're going to be accountable to it. We're accountable to the people. I think we owe it to our systems to help improve that person's kind of connectivity to the church. So really cleaning the data, I think, is going to be we're just seeing that as kind of a big lift right now before we even get into some of the other additional data sets that are available. It's like, let's clean our data. Let's make sure we actually know who's in the pew. We had one church that they have an attrition rate of small group leaders of 40% every year over year. 40% of their small group leaders
That's a lot of churn.
So we're talking to them like, hey, like, what if we actually knew the 40% that probably should have never been called into that leader, yet everybody's like, no, I could be a leader. Like, what if we actually started to see patterns? It's like, hey, actually, the gaps are the reason why we have that churn is because we have these 35-year-old couples that are leading the groups and they're just getting burned out based upon the people that are attending the group, right? Those are the types of things that I think we could actually steward the internal data of our church before we even look at some of the other metadata. I mean, tell me about the people. We should have basic information on our people. If we don't, we need to get there. First name, email, phone number, and again, in a clean data set so that we can actually communicate with the right person. Those are just some basic things that I'm seeing.
Yeah, that's good. And there's all sorts of, once you get that clean data set, there's all sorts of things that you can do, which is probably another episode. But Facebook audience targeting, lookalike audiences, all that kind of stuff, you know, even from an email address, there's a lot that can be done.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it this way, and I've told you this before, but like at the end of the day, what is wisdom?
Yeah.
And all wisdom is it's just having access to additional data points that somebody else didn't have, right? If you're older, you're probably wiser because you've experienced things, and that's data. You've come into things, and so you can be a little bit more wise with somebody who hasn't yet experienced those things. Jesus telling Peter to know, hey, row back out. I know you've been fishing all night, buddy, but go back out and throw your nets on this side of the boat. He just had wisdom, i.e. additional data that said the fish were over here. Like on 3 different times that happened. So that's where I feel that there is synergy and this collective desire to improve what we're doing within the ministry from that perspective of let's just improve our know and match and do that well. Not not change the, do a hard right on, what you believe on this or that or the other thing, but it's actually, no, just steward what you got and just improve the know and match side of it.
What about, I think as a final question, just want to talk about, we've touched on the theology of this a little bit, of data. I think you've shown, Nehemiah, and there's other examples in the Bible where having more information leads to different and better outcomes. And I think I know what you're going to say to this, but I struggle with this. So I'm opening myself up and all of my data and all of my preferences to Amazon through my purchasing and through user agreements that I agree to when I download an app like Facebook. And yeah, the microphone might be on, and I've agreed to it at some point. So what from a church perspective, if people allow us to see into their lives and have access to more of that data, is it still an invasion of privacy? Should we use it? Is it manipulative?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think we're still on the forefront of a lot of this stuff. I think that there is a creep factor that is evident, and I think we are seeing that, but I actually think it's reducing itself from the standpoint of there is desires to be fed information relative to me as a person. And I do think that you're starting to see sort of this idea of what used to be considered like institutional trust is now dissolving into this distributed trust model. So it's the equivalent of like Yelp. And hey, I'm looking for a restaurant. I'm not institutionally going to go to X restaurant anymore because I know that X restaurant. I'm actually going to pull up Yelp and see what 5,000 other people said about restaurants, and I'm going to go to that one. So I do think there's an element of people are willing to acknowledge that they want some personalization to this. Where the church lives in it, I actually think the church owns the space. The corporations, right, rely upon, they have a desire to develop a relationship with a person. They crush it in the sense of information and application. Amazon having information and then being able to apply it all day long, they're able to sell more products. The church is just gapped on the information and application stage, but the multiplying agent of that is relational. And so I say it this way. Back in the day, I was taught, information plus application equals transformation. Come to church, apply it, and you're transformed. When actually, I think the right equation is really information plus application multiplied by relationship equals transformation. So the church owns the relational capital space, bar none.
Yeah.
We have a responsibility to improve our visibility of the information and how we apply it in a good steward way, with good governance, with acknowledgement of transparency and trust, knowing that that's our foundational principle and core. So I actually think we get way more insights in an analog setting. We just do a really deficient job on the information and application side of it. So somebody comes into my office and is divulging a lot about themselves, and we're caring for them and we're restoring them and we're walking with them on a journey. If I could apply the information and application of that sequence to somebody else, would I be able to speed up and reduce what might be happening downstream? That's kind of the idea. So I don't think it's actually through the lens of like this creep factor. I think it's an accountability to God to say, actually, no, we've been pretty gapped in how we systematize some of our stuff to actually be accountable to improve the ministry.
Matt, some great thoughts. I really appreciate your time. And so for those that are interested, we're going to put some of those resources that Matt mentioned. Yeah. We're going to put information about Gloo into the show notes. So check those out. GLOO is the name of the company, Gloo. And Matt, thanks for being on today.
Yeah, hey man, I appreciate it. This is as our friend like VJ would say, right? There's 3 boxes: manage the present, selectively forget the past, create the future. We're definitely in this like create the future idea. So I really appreciate the time, my friend.
Yeah, it's been great. Well, thanks. God bless you and all you do.
Yep.